Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. One of the key ideas that is elaborated within Karl Popper's Towards a Rational Theory of Tradition is the distinction between two closely related social phenomena, that of tradition, which he's going to get at in this work and use the scientific or rationalist tradition as an example of, and then what he calls institutions. Now, he's not using these with any special meaning. He's talking about the sorts of things that we encounter in our day-to-day and professional and other venues of life, but he's looking at it from the perspective of what social science or theory should tell us about these. So he's going to talk about certain tasks or problems of social theory, and the first one he says is, explaining how unintended consequences of our intentions and actions arise, what kind of consequences will happen, and, certain social situations. And then he goes on and he says, it is especially the task of the social sciences to analyze in this way. So by analyzing those things, we're analyzing something else. What? The existence and the functioning of institutions. And what sort of things does he have in mind? Well, he tells you police forces, that's an institution. Or insurance companies, that's an institution as well. Or schools or governments. And then he says also of social collectives, such as states or nations or classes or other social groups. And here he's not quite so interested in the latter. He's much more interested in institutions themselves. But in the next paragraph, he's going to bring up a second and more important problem, which he says it can be phrased this way. What is the function of tradition in social life? Has it any function which is rationally understandable in the way in which, now notice he's going to make a reference here to institutions, in which we can give an account of the function of schools or of the police force or of a grocer's shop, the stock exchange, or other such social institutions? Can we analyze the functions of traditions? And he says that is perhaps the main task of a theory of tradition. And we're not going to see him talking that much about the difference and distinction between institutions and traditions until much later on, after he's carried out an analysis of a very important tradition, that of the rationalist or scientific one that originates, he thinks, in ancient Greece and continues forward into our own time. So, we've got these important tasks for social theory. How are traditions and institutions similar to, related to each other, but not exactly the same thing? So he begins by saying, much of what has been said here previously in the work of traditions can also be said of institutions. Why? Because traditions and institutions are in most respects strikingly similar. So similar that some people might in fact confuse the two, as he's going to point out a little bit later on in this. He will say that, some of the things that we call traditions may also be described as institutions, especially as institutions of that sub-society in which the tradition is generally followed. So we could say the rationalist tradition or the adoption of a critical attitude is institutional within the sub-society of scientific workers, or that the tradition of not kicking a man when he's down is almost a British institution. We can also say that the English language, though handed down by tradition, is an institution, but the practice of avoiding split infinitives is actually a tradition. So they're not exactly the same, right? How can we distinguish them? And Popper is going to say something here at the start that's a bit methodological. He says, I don't think it's going to be particularly helpful for us to try to begin with definitions. Instead, let's focus on examples that might help us to clarify it better. So he says, I've mentioned schools, a police force, a grocer's shop, and the stock exchange as examples of social institutions. So if you can wrap your head around those, you've got institutions. And then he says, elsewhere, such things as the burning interest in scientific research, or the scientist's critical attitude, or the attitude of tolerance, or the intolerance of the traditionalist or of the rationalist. These are examples of traditions. So you can see the difference there between the sorts of things that we apply these terms, institution and tradition, to. And he says, listen, they actually have a lot in common for analysis, but we can still nevertheless distinguish them. So he's going to provide something like definitions here, though he's not calling them definitions. He says, we may say that we are inclined to speak of institutions wherever a changing body of people observe a certain set of norms or fulfill certain prima facie social functions, such as teaching, policing, selling groceries, which serve certain prima facie social purposes, such as the propagation of knowledge, protection from violence, or starvation. So notice, there's already a lot of moving parts to an institution. Let's recap. He says, a changing body of people, so there's continuity over time between the people involved, right? Some are replaced, some are the replacers, and they will be replaced in turn. Norms are involved, fulfilling certain prima facie, that is, on their face, literally. We don't have to think deeply about them. You go into a grocery store, you're like, okay, I'm here to get groceries. This is what it is about, right? Policing, you go to a police department, and you're like, okay, somebody's going to be telling people what to do and arresting some people and releasing others. So certain prima facie social functions which serve social purposes. They are goal-directed. There's a point to them, right? Policing, protect the populace. Grocery stores, feed people, allow people to sell their groceries. So that's institutions. What about traditions? So he's going to give you, again, something like a definition here. He says, while we speak of traditions, mainly when we wish to describe a uniformity of people's attitudes or ways of behavior or aims or values or tastes. So, presumably, a tradition could work in any or all or some of those modalities. So, a tradition is going to include uniformity of peoples. That's the one thing that they all have in common. But then what? Could be attitudes, could be behavior, could be both of them together. It could be aims and values, or it could not include that. It might include tastes or sentiments or things along those lines. So, if we wanted to use an example that Popper isn't, if we are talking about, heavy metal music and the tradition of classic metal from the 1970s to the end of the 80s, and a revitalization of a new wave of traditional heavy metal. We can say there's certain attitudes about how things ought to sound. There's certain tastes, There should be a kind of heaviness to it, but maybe it's not cool to have the drumming that is all 16th notes, precision, or certain guitar effects or things like that. That could be a tradition. Now, he says something really, really important about what happens with traditions. He says that traditions are perhaps more closely bound up with persons, their likes and dislikes, their hopes and fears, than are institutions. It's not that people don't have hopes and fears. Take, for example, going to college or university, right? You hope to actually learn something, to have a job at the end of it, if you're not independently wealthy, which almost none of us are, right? There's a vocational aspect to education. There's all sorts of hopes you have. You could also have all sorts of fears, and the college or university itself could be an institution. Higher education can be an institution. But traditions are more closely connected with that for people. And so Popper is going to say traditions take, as it were, an intermediate place in social theory between persons and institutions. And he's got a really interesting remark here. He says, we speak more naturally of a living tradition than that of a living institution. It's taken for granted that an institution should be living, it should be going on and on and on in time, and all of those sorts of things. So we've got, on the one hand, people, individuals, who are the units within society doing things, having intentions, experiencing fears, desires, whatever else it is. And then we have institutions, and then in between them, we have traditions. And this gives tradition an incredibly important role in dealing with what he's going to call the ambivalence of social institutions. What is this? The fact that a social institution may, in certain circumstances, function in a way which strikingly contrasts with its prima facie or proper function. So he uses a couple examples of this. Boarding schools in the time of Charles Dickens had deviated or been perverted from their proper function, so they become places for sadism to be practiced. I mean, we could say this about 20th century novels about how much it sucks to be in a British boarding school as well. You could read Graham Greene or people like that. Or police forces. What are police forces supposed to be doing? Protecting people from blackmail, but, maybe the police use threats of blackmail, threats of violence or imprisonment to blackmail people. He also talks about parliamentary opposition. One of its prima facie functions is to prevent the government from stealing the taxpayers' money, but it can become just a way of proportionally dividing the spoils. And so this is always possible. You can have corruption or perversion of institutions. What helps to stand in the way? So he says, it is here that traditions may play an important role as intermediaries between persons and institutions. Now, of course, he says traditions can be perverted. Something corresponding to the ambivalence here described affects them too. But since their character is somewhat less instrumental than that of institutions, they are less affected by this ambivalence. But they are more impersonal than persons, right? They're nearly as impersonal as institutions, less personal, more predictable than the individuals who man the institutions. And then he goes on to say something else that I think is particularly interesting. It may be said that the long-term proper functioning of institutions depends mainly on such traditions. It is the tradition that gives persons who come and go the background and that certainty of purpose which resist corruption. A tradition is, as it were, capable of extending something of the personal attitude of its founder far beyond its personal life. So Popper is actually making a pretty strong claim here. If you want institutions to continue to function in the way that they ought to, at least most of the time, because you're never going to have perfect institutions, you need something that isn't just an institution. You need traditions. You need uncorrupted traditions to help guide how people interact within the institution. And so, this is a really important factor. We're going to look at an example of this. There is one other point that we want to call to mind that I think is also quite insightful. So Popper will tell us that the connotation of tradition is an allusion, that is a reference to imitation. How do we actually learn how to get by within a tradition, whether it be a musical one about, social tasks that we have, education, how we cook? We imitate. We don't just get a recipe book. We see how grandma makes the pie, what steps she takes. We do some of it. If we're going to learn what a certain genre of music is like, well, we got to listen to a lot of music. If you want to be a good writer, you got to read other people and you got to practice, right? Institution doesn't have this connotation of imitation. It has more of a connotation of you adapt yourself to the institution that you find yourself in. So that's another important way of distinguishing between these two social, let's call them factors. But let's talk about the example that he uses. So he says, we can exemplify this by considering certain aspects of the social institution of language. Now, he's going to invoke Karl K. Bühler, who distinguished language or communication into three functions. Are these the only functions of language? No, there's plenty of other ones out there. But let's go with this for a moment. So there's an expressive function. The communication serves to express emotions or thoughts of the speaker. Signaling or stimulative or release function. The communication serves to stimulate or release certain reactions in the hearer. And a descriptive function. The communication describes a certain state of affairs. And we can separate each of these. They can be independent of each other. And Popper's going to say animals have the first two. Human beings seem to have all three of these. And then he says, I think we have to add a fourth function to this, one which is particularly important from our point of view, the argumentative or explanatory function. Presentation and comparison of arguments or explanations in connection with certain definite questions or problems. And a certain language might possess the first three functions without the fourth, like a child at the age of just naming things. And Popper's going to say, insofar as language qua institution has these functions, it may be ambivalent. It can be used by the speaker to hide his emotions or thoughts just as much to express them, or to repress rather than to stimulate argument. And there are different traditions associated with each one of these functions. So he says there are different traditions of Italy and England, where we English have the tradition of understatement in connection with the expressive function. And he says this becomes really important in connection with the two characteristically human functions, descriptive and argumentative. In its descriptive function, we can talk about language as a vehicle of truth, but it can also become a vehicle of falsity. So corruption, deviation from the prima facie functions of expressive, or not expressive, but descriptive language, that's always possible. What keeps that from degenerating? Well, a tradition that works against this ambivalence and in favor of the use of language for the purpose of correct description. right? Without this, he says the descriptive function of language would actually perish because children would never learn descriptive use. And we need this to prevent the misuse of language that consists in pseudo-arguments and propaganda. So traditions can actually play an incredibly important role in the institution of language. They can have this corrective function, but only if those traditions themselves don't get corrupted or perverted, which is always a possibility. So some really interesting and important reflections on the mediating function of traditions between persons on the one hand and institutions on the other, and on the differences and similarities between traditions and institutions.